At first glance, the idea of Netflix acquiring Warner Bros. For $72 billion sounds like pure speculation. It feels too large, too disruptive, and too unrealistic to be taken seriously. Yet the fact that this idea continues to surface in industry discussions says a lot about how unstable and compressed the global media landscape has become. Netflix has not acquired Warner Bros., but everything about this hypothetical deal reveals where power, pressure, and strategy in entertainment are heading. The $72 billion figure often mentioned in these conversations reflects more than just a purchase price. It represents the scale of what it would take to absorb Warner Bros. Discovery's assets, while accounting for its debt, legacy operations, and intellectual property. Any company attempting such a deal would not simply be buying a studio. It would be inheriting decades of contracts, production systems, labor agreements, and financial obligations. This alone makes the idea extraordinary. From Netflix's perspective, the strategic logic behind such an acquisition is clear. Netflix is the world's largest streaming platform, but it is still fundamentally a distribution company. While it produces original content, it does not own a century-deep library of franchises, characters, and classic films. Warner Bros. Brings exactly that. DC properties, HBO's premium catalog, iconic film franchises, and decades of television content would instantly give Netflix one of the strongest content libraries ever assembled under a single platform. Owning those assets outright would dramatically reduce Netflix's dependence on licensing deals. Instead of negotiating for content windows or losing shows to competitors, Netflix would control distribution permanently. That kind of ownership creates long-term stability in an industry where content costs continue to rise and competition keeps intensifying. However, this deal would fundamentally change Netflix's business model. Netflix has grown by staying relatively asset-light compared to traditional studios. It commissions content, analyzes performance data, and adapts quickly. Warner Bros. Operates on a very different rhythm. Theatrical releases, long production timelines, unionized labor, and legacy cable operations introduce complexity that Netflix has largely avoided. Integrating these two companies would not just be a financial challenge, it would be a cultural one. Netflix is built around speed, experimentation, and data-driven decisions. Warner Bros. Is built around creative tradition, long-term franchises, and institutional processes. Merging those cultures could slow Netflix down at a time when agility is one of its biggest advantages. Financially, a $72 billion acquisition would be transformative and risky. Netflix has historically avoided massive, debt-heavy acquisitions. Absorbing Warner Bros. Would almost certainly require significant borrowing, equity dilution, or both. That would reshape Netflix's balance sheet and change how investors evaluate the company. Netflix would shift from being viewed as a scalable, technology-driven media platform to a heavily leveraged entertainment conglomerate. For Warner Bros. Discovery, the appeal of being acquired lies in financial pressure. The company carries substantial debt from previous mergers and restructuring. Traditional cable revenue has declined faster than expected, and the transition to streaming has been expensive and complex. Running multiple platforms while funding premium content has strained cash flow. Being acquired by Netflix would offer scale, global distribution, and a clear streaming-first future. But this deal would face enormous regulatory obstacles. A Netflix-Warner Bros. Merger would immediately attract antitrust scrutiny in the United States and abroad. Regulators would examine market concentration, control over content, pricing power, and the impact on competitors and creators. Combining the largest streaming platform with one of the largest content producers would raise concerns unlike any previous media merger. Even if regulators approved the deal, the operational focus required could distract Netflix from its core mission. Managing film studios, cable networks, sports rights, and theatrical releases would add layers of complexity. Netflix's strength has always been simplicity. One global platform, one primary revenue model. Warner Bros. Would introduce fragmentation that could dilute strategic clarity. The reason this hypothetical acquisition continues to be discussed is not because it is likely, but because it highlights the consolidation pressure facing streaming. Subscriber growth is slowing in mature markets. Content costs are rising. Investors are demanding profitability instead of pure growth. owning scale is no longer enough. Companies want defensible libraries, strong franchises, and predictable cash flows. A Netflix-Warner Bros. Deal represents the most extreme version of that logic. It is consolidation taken to its limit. It shows how far companies might go to secure control over intellectual property and distribution at the same time. It also signals a broader shift in power. Traditional studios once dictated terms to distributors. Streaming reversed that relationship. Platforms now control data, customer relationships, and global reach. Any future mega deal would reflect that reality, with technology-driven platforms absorbing legacy media rather than the other way around. In practical terms, $72 billion would buy Netflix control, but at a cost. Control over franchises, control over global distribution, control over long-term content strategy. But it would also bring debt, regulation, and operational drag. Netflix has historically avoided all three. That is why this acquisition remains hypothetical. The barriers are enormous, and the risks are real. Yet the fact that it feels conceivable reveals how unsettled the entertainment industry still is. The old models are broken. The new ones are still evolving. And no company is completely secure. Everything about Netflix acquiring Warner Bros. Is less about whether the deal will happen, and more about what it represents. It represents financial strain in legacy media, strategic ambition in streaming, and an industry searching for a stable end state. Netflix may never buy Warner Bros., but the idea itself reflects a media landscape where scale, ownership, and survival are being renegotiated in real time. And that is why this hypothetical $72 billion deal continues to capture so much attention.